Hello, Hildy, and welcome to all who are joining and watching this opportunity for Hildy and I to have a conversation. Both of us felt that there are lots of people with lots of history around creating the future, around the different frameworks that have come out of the work that Hildy, you have done and others have contributed to. And the the thing that is creating the future, which includes all of that, is certainly at a big transition point. There has been a lot of evolution over the past couple of years, and we wanted to use this as an opportunity to speak from and share from the perspective of myself as a fellow of creating the future, and also a board member, and now something else member as that conversation has evolved, and then certainly Hildy, your experience, being a driving force behind a lot of the work and a lot of what is evolving and happening. So that's what we're here to do, and to really take an opportunity for you and I think, to talk about the different elements of both what's going on, and also I think for some of us to help us understand how we got to this point in time, which is really all that we are, as a point in time. So, I think, Hildy, as you and I prepared for this, we talked about both of you and I have different roles that we've played. As I said, for myself, I am a fellow. I took an immersion course when there was one of the initial transitions, I think, or earlier transitions. I have also been a board member. So I think my questions for you, and some of my answers probably as we talk, come from both of those perspectives, and how I engage in kind of all of that.
And you have been in different roles, a supporter. You have contributed in lots of different ways over time. And yes, it's one of the things that I love about creating the future is pretty much everybody who has gotten involved in some way is involved in more than just one way. Because it really is about contributing who we are and receiving from who we are. Yeah. Because it's not a normal thing, as most of us know already.
Yeah. And I guess I would also call myself an active trier. I try a lot of this stuff on.
An experimenter.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, I think from that perspective, one of the curiosities that I know I've watched, but I think is helpful to allow you to add your thoughts and experience with, is really getting to the catalytic thinking framework. I think, it's so when I first got involved with creating the future was, I think you framed it to me as a transition point in how you were thinking about it, that I think many of us are familiar with the Pollyanna principles and where that came from, and the early days of what was called community impact planning piece. And I really, I'd like to hear your words of sort of what that transition point was, where you really felt like there was that's my observation, it felt like there was this sort of explosion moment where it was like a giant aha that went from the big ideas of Pollyanna principle, but it was sort of pragmatized in the Pollyanna principles, and I think it theorized in a way that still is pragmatic. And I don't know if I'm jumping back and forth with that, but if you could sort of share from that point where you felt that big aha was, and what shifted for you in the thinking, and helped get us to what is now being talked about as catalytic thinking.
Yeah. I think that those last few words is being talked about, because what's interesting, you guys know that this has been an evolution. This has been an evolution that's been going on for 20 years. It started when Dimitri and I, in the late 90s, started to rethink, why is what we're doing not creating change? And that was evolutionary over time. We'd try a little bit of this, and if it led towards change, either organizationally or out in the world, we kept doing it, and if we didn't, we set it aside. And what led to the Pollyanna Principles, which was, I wrote it in 2007, 2008, which is 10 years ago. So let's start with that. But was sort of looking back and going, okay, what's at the core of this? And from there, we said, we want to teach this. And so that led to what was the initial immersion classes that many people who are watching may have taken. And what was a drumbeat all the time from the minute, and the reason we were teaching it is because people kept coming to us and saying, what are you doing that's different than what I'm doing? Because you're creating leaps that I'm not able to get. And so people were asking us to teach it. So we started to teach it. We taught it to consultants. We taught what we thought we were teaching at the time, which is what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And we were teaching it to consultants. We were teaching it to people who were on the ground as change makers. And a couple of things became clear. One, people would leave the class and they would all say the same thing. How do I talk about this? The second thing that would happen is that people were saying things like, this is subversive. This isn't about just boards. And we'd go, yeah, we know that. This isn't just about planning or fundraising. Yeah, we know that. And so people's experience of it, and I think about Alexandra and her sister Fiona, both of whom had taken the class, not been very involved. And because they were sisters, they would see each other all the time, and they would sort of whisper in the kitchen saying, I'm asking all of those questions that are supposedly planning questions. I'm asking them in my daily life. I'm asking them in my family. I'm thinking, and so people were sharing those kinds of stories. And again, asking, how do we talk about this? As we started to have more and more of those conversations during immersion, and because this is a way of thinking, immersion was a wonderful place for people to be talking, and my thinking to be evolving as I was in the classes and as I was talking about it and teaching it. And the beauty of, no matter when somebody was a seasoned participant, even if it was 2 or 3 classes after, so they took it in class number 4, they were a seasoned participant in number 8, they'd look back and go, this is really different. So it had been evolving all along, and especially how we talked about it. And at the same time, you guys may remember Zach Breaker and Dave Svett were helping us with messaging to talk about what is creating the future. And simultaneous with that, I was doing a lot of public speaking. And as a keynote speaker, you got to be able to say in 45 minutes, what is this thing? And so the constant drumbeat of refining how we talk about it. And that's really, I think, what has changed, because the thinking undergirding it feels the same to everybody, because it is the same. Mm-hmm. What we now look at as catalytic listening, what we taught in the very, very first immersion classes was what we used to call the listening buckets. We're listening for people's strengths. We're listening for their values. We're listening for their outcomes. We're listening to hold space for them. We're listening to notice. That hasn't changed at all. But where we're talking about it is as a way of holding space for people and paying attention to people. The concept of causality. We've been talking about that since the beginning. The fact that we can create causality. We always think of being subject to causality, but the fact that we can create causality. Well, we can create it in our lives. We can create it for our clients. We can create it in our organizations, in our governments. That hasn't changed at all. But how we're talking about it has changed. The concepts around collective enoughness. It's beautiful to have these words now that we're going to, oh yeah, that. But people say, oh, that's the diaper bank model. We built the diaper bank in 1998, 1999. So it is not so much that the thinking has changed, but really how we're talking about the thinking. Mm-hmm. that has changed. And a leap came, you talked about some of those aha moments. A leap came when we spent so much wonderful time with Zach Breaker and Dave Svett talking about messaging. And we came to that place of, okay, what is the real core here? Change the questions, change the world was a big, and it just makes it so clear, and it raises the question people ask, okay, so what are the questions? Because that's what comes out of that, and it's a beautiful way of being able to categorize, coming up with the fact that it all focused around three tenets. That that our power to create change is our power to create cause and effect conditions towards change. That the most favorable condition we could create is about people. That the whole thing of collective enoughness, that together we have everything we need, and that only on our own do we experience scarcity, which is about the people and about creating causality. So that ability to hone it really, really sharply, that's really what's changed, is how we're talking about it, and then what that makes possible. Because the more accessible the language is for people, it again creates those, oh yeah, I get it, in a conversation, rather than, yeah, okay, so we're like doing this thing, and yeah, so which is how a lot of people felt, especially in the early days coming out of immersion, is like, oh wow, I have made a huge leap and I have no clue how to talk about it, and now they know how to talk about it.
And it really strikes me that you talk about that triad of ideas, and I know one of the way you visually represent it is a triangle that talks about people really at the apex of that, and then thinking about the situations, which is the causality, the conditions that people experience, and then the reality that it's when people, engage in those experiences, that we get the reactions and the results that we see. And I think being able to see how ideas like collective enoughness feed into that construct, and some of the other tools and frameworks that you've introduced, the continuum of potential to really, and the listening, those elements of really trying to help us deeply understand people. And I know for me, as the practitioner trier, I think the aha that really settled into me, and I know we often hear you and others say, it's about the people, not the thing, but that real sort of for me, it's become an orthodoxy in a way, in sort of the most beneficial way, but reminding myself that outcomes are people behaving in a particular way. That's what it is. It's, even the collective enoughness. I look, and I think I may have shared this, driving down the road and looking at all the stuff around us, and it has nothing to do with an economy. It has to do with somehow people took natural resources, put them together, and yeah, we got a rocket ship out of that. We got an internet out of that. But it was people fundamentally at the root of it. And so I think that is both a challenge to so much of this, is because we as we talk to people and we talk about outcomes, we talk about changing, we are talking about changing people and their behaviors in some very, very supportive ways. But I know for me that even as I followed and experienced that shift and evolution of both articulation and I think expansion of the ideas too, that came out of the Pollyanna principles of, just as you said, the planning was less about planning. It was about people.
How they can make decisions.
Yeah. And coming from a person-centric.
Yeah, it is absolutely. And what's really been interesting about the understanding that in every single case, it's about the people and not about the thing. Is you can go back and look at, we thingize everything. The most recent example you and I have talked about is the article that I penned about healthcare. There is no people in that discussion. We talk about healthcare, it's a thing. We talk about the affordable thing, care thing, act thing. We talk about pre-existing conditions rather than I'm sick. And so the language, looking at when we focus on things, it always fails. The war on drugs It wasn't how can people be healthy and whole. It was the war on drugs. It's the war on terror. It's a thing, and we thingize it, and we go after the thing. And you're absolutely right. Collective enoughness is entirely about our relationship with scarcity and our relationship with each other. And it comes down to the question of, can we trust each other? Can we share with each other? If I share, you're just going to take my shit. We've had that so often, and you've been part of discussions at the board level where we've talked about openly sharing our ideas, and that while yes, you can take classes and go deep and learn stuff, that we have so much that we just share for free, and we want people to take and repeat. Ideally, we want people to honor the source, to reference the source and be explicit about that. It's not just because it's good for creating the future, but because it helps build the wisdom on the wisdom. That if people know that it's shared language, that they're not saying, they're not in a room where somebody's going, that thing that you're talking about, or that article you read, it sounds just like what Creating the Future is doing, and then having to go, oh yeah, well, it's what it is. There's so much benefit that we get together, but the whole point is, if we feel that we can trust and bring out the best in each other, and that's really what it's about, is we have the ability at every moment to bring out the best in each other by our attitudes and our assumptions. And if I assume that I must hoard my resources, then I'm not going to bring out the best in you. I'm going to push you as far away as I possibly can. And what will bring out the best in the situation? If I'm kind, if I'm sharing, if I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. But that's really that whole piece about bringing out the best in people and bringing out the best in situations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think absolutely the thingizing, the collective enoughness and resources. It's just never about the resources. It's about how we feel about the resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and that leads me to the ongoing conversations that have been happening at the board level around the shape, around the thing of creating the future. And I think it's interesting, as you're saying that, to come from that perspective of, as a board member, and anyone who goes back and watches the board meetings will hear a variety of people say, what is it we're making a decision about? The thingizing. And there has always been that tension of, are we actually stewards of an entity? Are we stewards of an idea? Are we a space for thinking? And I think out of that curiosity of questions and the real forming of the language around that vision of creating the future, the one, and to the degree that we're, even in the last board meeting, we were still talking about refining some of that vision statement of, but when it took us up to, people thriving and people behaving with one another in a humane way, the degree to which, when we started talking about that, it really made a bunch of decisions for us, very, very clearly. That there are several points that I know I've been a part of where the answer was quite clear, because when we basically started to ask that question around, greater humanity, people bringing out the best in each other in all that they do, that presupposes something so much larger than an organization. It no longer part of. I was trying to think about how to talk about it, but when you talk about how people are behaving with one another on a day-to-day basis, that can never equal a program or an organization, because there are so many factors that influence that if that's your goal, you can't get there by thinking about a program.
Well, and it is systemically what we have created, both governmentally and business-wise. There is no sector that doesn't think about it in exactly the way that you talked about it. It is a couple things. One, from the beginning, we talked about creating the future having a 10-year mission, and that we would know when it's time to start the clock, which started just this year, that we'd be ready. And we'd have pieces in place, and we didn't exactly know what that meant, but we knew that we'd know. And that 10-year clock, that 10-year mission is, if we change the questions that are deeply embedded in systems we all use day to day, workplace systems, but also systems of how we be with each other, how I talk to the clerk at the grocery store, that if we change those questions as ubiquitously as possible in as many systems and environments around the world, within 10 years' time, how much more humane could the world be? And so looking at that through that 10-year lens, we've always said as well that we used to call ourselves a living laboratory. You may remember those days when we said creating the future is a living laboratory. Again, a language shift that really was an aha for people was when we stopped talking about it as a laboratory and started talking about it as an experiment. It shifted. I could probably spend the next hour talking about why I think that is, but the questions changed. When we would say we were a laboratory, people would say, well, what do you do in the laboratory? When we say we're an experiment, they say, what are you experimenting with? Very different questions. Very different questions. And so what we're experimenting with is all of these different frameworks. What do they look like in practice? And there's two ways that we experiment with them. We experiment with them in pilot projects with other people, with other entities where we partner together and do, or we experiment with them internally on ourselves. And one of the things that we said early on is it's nobody's job anywhere to experiment systemically and see what it looks like on themselves. Consultants and academics do it on other people. They study it, they write it down, but they're very dispassionate. They have a lot of set ideas about what should happen, but it's nobody's job to say, we're just going to jump into it and see what happens. And so with knowing that we had nothing to lose, said, okay, that'll be us. And, you've been part of so many of those conversations, Justin. I mean, when we hired Candace years ago, suddenly we had an employee. We talked about what does catalytic thinking look like in employee policies. And at every point, the decision to open our meetings to everybody and to stream them live and to have the ongoing conversations, which has led to almost every one of our board meetings. We've got way more people who are not on the board than are on the board and contributing. And that understanding that we're just going to try it and see what happens, coming from the core assumption that we do things the way we do them because that's the way we do them. There's like no good reason. And frequently they came from bad reasons, which were reactive reasons. So we have employee policies the way we have employee policies because we're preventing something bad from happening. Okay, so if we don't have to assume that there's any givens other than the law, which is just a base minimum, if we don't have to assume any givens when it comes to employee policies, when it comes to opening up our meetings, when it comes to what is a board, or do we even need a board, that has guided everything that we've done for years. And so it made logical sense that the evolution of the conversation, starting, if you really think about it, starting at the very beginning with the first board meeting we ever had in 2011. This has been coming for a long time. And people who were on the board then, Mark Riffey, Sydney, have said, yeah, this is sort of what we were talking about early on and didn't know what question we were asking. I remember years ago, the board members would joke that they weren't a board, they were a collection of people doing their damnedest to not be a board. If that doesn't say how dysfunctional boards are, that they were going to do anything they could to not be a board. Okay, so if you're not a board, what does good look like? That's really, I don't know if you remember, but this whole restructuring that we're going through began in 2015, when we started the conversation about board recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
And the question that board members had over and over again is, well, I'm not entirely sure if I invite somebody what I'm inviting them to. And we dove in and started, and the more we asked the question, and it was at that time that we were talking about being more movement-like. And the article that I posted at Stanford about what's the difference between movements and organizations. And as you were talking about before, these monoliths, these programs that we build that don't have the opportunity to be everything they can because of the constraints that we've created around them. We just kept asking more and more, do we have to do it this way? And so the thing that we came to when, as you said, the question was sort of didn't even need to be answered. It was just sort of out there, was if we didn't have this structure that we have because everybody else has it, and they have it because everybody else has it, and this is the way we do things, what would we build to accomplish huge missions? And living inside that question, you and I have talked about this. I don't know that we're ever going to fully answer that question. I think that whatever structure this entity, this thing that is creating the future takes, is going to be evolving forever and ever and ever until we decide there's not a thing there. But it's just living inside that question. It's being the experiment to say, okay, so what would a structure look like that would support accomplishing missions? You so often, in every meeting I'm in with you at some point about something, reference a group that's doing their best to buck a system. Not realizing they can change the system, but that they're constantly coming up against systems. What would systems look like if they were not only an obstacle, but were actually pushing you forward? What would the system look like that's actually an active participant in moving the mission forward?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but isn't that going to be fun to find out?
Well, and definitely those questions, I think, are challenging to think about in the context of, again, some of those preconceived notions. So as we talk about an organization, a board, that when we ask those questions, it challenges us again, because we come at it from the perspective of, if it's pointed towards a human endeavor, then the preservation of the thing is not the priority. And so I think that has certainly been one of those questions, and we've talked about that at the board meeting, which is, am I here to shepherd the viability of what? And when we release ourselves from that construct of I'm here to ensure the viability of an entity, it does unlock a lot of those questions. And I think, again, as we ask that question around, what does lead to a more humane world, it was quite clear that it is a movement. It is not the actions of a single entity, and that recognizing that, okay, if that is a condition, that movements exist, that does then reshape the thinking about what any entity or any structure or system needs to look like, because it needs to feed towards that goal. And I know that that's influenced a lot of what's happening on the ground, I guess is sort of the best way to talk about it with regard to, creating the future. And so share a little bit about where the entity of creating the future is.
Where are we right now?
Yeah.
And I also just want to share in terms of language, we can see it as a challenge, or we can see it as having permission and encouragement.
Mm-hmm.
And when we see it as a challenge, we go in, and when we see it as, oh, well, we've got permission and encouragement to think about this differently. And it unlocks stuff. It unlocks stuff. Where we are is a couple of things. The board in 2016 had the delicious conversation, and I may insert a clip as we finalize this. The board in 2016 had a really, really delicious conversation about, okay, we've been talking about this now for a year, maybe 18 months. Do we want to decide that we're going to do this? It will likely mean, and so what is the this? What we've been talking about is restructuring, creating the future, so that it is not a monolithic, hierarchical, or even central, because a lot of flat models are centralized and come out from the center. What would it look like if decision making were entirely localized? Localized meaning Justin wants to go off and do a project, and it seems like it would further our mission, and it would further Justin's heart and soul and work. How can you plug in? What's there that you might be able to plug in? What could you benefit from plugging into creating the future, and your work would further our mission? And what's that relationship? And so we've been talking about creating the future, creating the future as a networked platform where people can plug in, do work that is meaningful to them in whatever way they define work and whatever way they define meaningful. And that furthers our mission, and that those decisions would be made locally. So there might be, for instance, and we don't know yet, but this is a way it might be. There may be, you may want to do a project around a specific type of planning that you're thinking about doing, and you want to play with it, and you want to include 3 or 4 different organizations that are doing a pilot project. There may be a team that are people who get that and love that, who decide, is that a fit? In what way is that a fit? It's a fit where, wow, okay, Creating the Future wants to play with you on that. We really want to be part of that. And who's the we, and what does part of that mean? Or it could be, wow, you want to plug in and just share what you're learning? That would be awesome too. And there's a million different, things in between there. But that decision wouldn't be made, heavens no, not by Hildy, but even by a centralized team. And it certainly wouldn't be made by a board who, in any organization, anywhere, corporate, nonprofit, doesn't matter, boards don't know jack. And we're under this delusion that because they're supposedly at the top of the hierarchy, that they're leading, which is just this ridiculous lie we're telling ourselves, that whenever things go wrong, what's the first thing people ask is, where was the board? Well, where the board was sitting there going, I don't know what's going on. Do you know what's going on? Because that's what boards do. So why do we keep lying to ourselves? What would it look like if decision-making, which is what boards do, they lead and make decision-making, what if that happened locally by the people who actually knew what was going on? And that somebody in Washington, D.C. or Tucson, Arizona didn't have to make a decision, or a team that's located wherever didn't have to make a decision about what's going on with a group that wants to do something in Johannesburg. So looking at decision-making through that lens, and you were part of, and many of our fellows and supporters were part of conversations early on when we were exploring with Chloe Wertini from Inspiral, a group who has been looking at they've been really leading the charge from the social enterprise sphere in New Zealand, and they look at what they call a minimum viable board. What do we need to be legal? What do we need to be good stewards? What do we need to be fiduciary? Okay, that doesn't have to run things. Mm-hmm. And so some of what we've been looking at in the theoretical space is that, what does a network platform look like? What does it mean to plug in wherever you want? What do you get if you plug in? If you get something, where does that thing come from? What's supporting that thing that you get? Who's in the platform? Who answers the phone if you pick up and call? If you send an email to the website that says, I'd love to do something with you guys, who types the answer? And so, I mean, we're at the point now of really looking at those very logistical kinds of questions. of what is this thing. And one of the things that it made us realize is that this is sort of phase 2 of creating the future. And I said before, we said that the 10-year clock would start and we'd know when it is. And looking back in hindsight, realizing that was really phase 1. Phase 1 was founder driven. Phase 1 was a small group of us working together on some stuff and seeing, identifying what we had. What is this thing? You and many others have been concerned over time that we haven't sought funding. A piece of why we haven't sought funding is because values-wise, we don't want to be supporting a power dynamic that we don't believe in. But another piece of it is funding for what? I'm not really sure. Well, we got sort of this program here, we got sort of, and then you wind up in that very, very traditional place, and we're a non-traditional thing. So now that we're able to talk, I know exactly what we're going to be. We're going to be this thing that's weird and out there, and scaling from what 100 of us could do to what thousands of us could do. And what is that going to take? And so right now where we are is really in those conversations, is asking, and I'm doing a lot of sleuthing. I'm doing, there's sort of two things going on simultaneously. I'm doing a lot of sleuthing, a lot of researching, and working with Rebecca, who is co-leading Creating the Future with me, and Anne Vermel, looking at establishing partnerships with funders who are excited about something cool, that want to play with that, because it's going to there's so much going on at Creating the Future just to run the day-to-day now, that to go out and do the immense research of what will it take to actually build this thing and what will it look like when it's built. So simultaneously looking at figuring out what it'll look like and funding what that will be. That is a chunk of it. And then the other chunk of what's going on is, ever since we started to have the conversations at the board level, we started walking the talk of what we wanted to be, because that felt much more right than the other way. Mm-hmm. And so the conversations the board has been having, the sharing of leadership, the sharing of decision-making, the sharing of jobs, and people have been stepping into a lot of different roles. Lisa Humanek has stepped into heading faculty development to develop systems for teaching teachers. Susan Detweiler and Mark Pittman are running the consultants group. So there's, and at the top of all of that, Rebecca stepping in to co-lead everything that's going on at Creating the Future. There used to be one person teaching in-person immersion. There's now 5 non-Hildy teachers teaching immersion online on a regular basis. And so that sort of distribution of the work is sort of a piece of what that's going to feel like, and the joy of stuff going on in various parts of Creating the Future, all guided by the framework, all guided by those questions. So if, and I guess that's the part of the localized decision making. We know that if people are asking the questions of catalytic thinking, that they're going to come to answers that are aligned with our vision and our values. And so in all of these realms where people are doing the work that they're even currently doing, because they're asking the questions, it doesn't have to be centralized. Mm-hmm. The questions are at the heart. And so that allows it to be as distributed as it can be, so long as the questions are at the heart of that decision making, mm-hmm. which is the long babbly sort of where we are. So the answer is twofold. One, we're acting distributed now, as distributed as we can. We're acting shared leadership as much as we can. And 2, we're looking to scale that so that the mission scales. It's really about scaling the mission. And so often when we talk about scale, we're talking about scaling an organization. And what we're talking about is scaling what it's going to take to accomplish the mission, mm-hmm. which is big.
And a lot of discovery around what that distributed network would actually look like, and how it would serve people and support people and engage people.
Yeah, and the fun of that exploration, and again, because everything we do is open and out there, is that as we're learning, we're co-learning with others who are on this journey, because we're not the only ones that are looking at this question,
Mm-hmm.
and sharing what we're learning and evolving as we go. So my guess is, if you and I had this conversation in 3 years, Creating the Future would look very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And then another 3 years from that, we'd still look very different from that prior 3 years, because we're stepping into stuff nobody's done.
So as you think about folks who came into contact with Creating the Future, in those early years, sort of, let's say that those first 3 to 4 years of the last 10, so trying to practice what we do, what questions would you like them asking or seeking answers to?
I think the question that I love having anybody ask is, what are the conditions for me, not Hildy, but for you, for me, to bring out the best in myself and in others? And a big piece of that is listening. A big piece of that is understanding that we can react or create. A big piece of that is being open to sharing. But I think that the questions I would want to see people asking aren't so much asking of us, but asking of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is around what brings out the best in me, what brings out the best in the people I love, what brings out the best in the people I work with, what brings out the best in the people I encounter every day. And it gets back to those pages in the Pollyanna Principles where I talk about the fact that what makes us human is not what we generally call human nature, which is all the bad stuff. That's just human nature. No, human nature is our ability to connect with people that we can't envision, that we can't see, but to sense that are out there. All of those wonderful things that bring out the best. That's the questions I'd love to see people asking. Mm-hmm. What would it take for me to be more of that? For me to step into my natural ability to be kind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think, a lot of us always have a curiosity of where you are personally in this, because you have been vital and critical and such a driving force. And I know you have a picture of sort of where you're headed. And I'm curious if you could just share a bit about that, which is not so much the doing, not what it is you're doing right now, but as you you would frame this question as when you're reflecting on yourself, is what does the body of work, the things that you are excited about being able to do as Hildy moving forward?
So I'll start with what it's not. Start with what it's not and then reframe to what it is. What it's not is running Creating the Future. So just flat out, many people assume that as a founder, that my vision would be that I want to run this thing. You could not find somebody worse to run this. Yeah, you probably could. But my gifts and my brilliance are not running things. My gifts and my brilliance are pushing the thinking. So first, I want to be able to be part of Creating the Future like everybody else. I want to be able to plug into that networked platform and say, I've got this really cool project. What does it make sense? So rather than being the driving force, having the questions be the driving force and having somebody who's in their brilliance, coordinating it. So that's a big piece of it. And me in my brilliance, I'm writing, I'm thinking, I'm pushing boundaries, I'm networking and talking to people about cool stuff. I had a brilliant conversation the other day. It started out talking about the restructuring, but 2.5 hours later, it was about just about everything. And came back to the restructuring and talking about democracy and talking about, what this gentleman was saying is as you're talking about sort of sharing leadership, I'm thinking about movements towards democracy in this country right now in these particular days. And that's where the thinking sparks, and I'm able to go, oh, you know what? This goes there and this fits here. That's where I want to be. Mm-hmm. I want to be free to play with that stuff, because it's also what brings clarity. It's what brought clarity to the conversation and has continued to. And that's where I'm really in my joy. Mm-hmm. Is when I have that ability to, I think while I'm writing. You guys have frequently heard me say I can't think without a pen in my hand. I don't know my thoughts until they're down on paper. I go, whoa, look at that. I'd love to be able to be doing more of that and making those connections.
Yeah, it sounds to me, and these are putting my words on what I'm hearing, just to be clear, of there's a passion there for the synthesizing of the different ideas that are out there, the sense making, and then the sharing. My little alliteration there, synthesizing, sense making, and sharing. It seems very exciting.
It is really exciting, and I think one of the most exciting things about catalytic thinking, when you start to dig into it, is the understanding that this framework is not anything that we invented. It's not anything I invented. That this is taking the wisdom of thousands of years of just about every tradition, of looking at faith traditions, looking at history and sociology, looking at physics. Cause and effect is physics. Looking at math, looking at the questions at the heart of behavioral psychology and neuroscience. It's all the same question. And the joy that I get and the ahas of reading something in behavioral psychology and reading something in physics and pulling it together and going, this is all the same question and it's all the same answer. And being able to translate that and put it into words, because I know that one of the gifts I do have, and I understand that as humans, we get our gifts because we inherited them from someplace else. I don't see them as this is a Hildy thing. This is what the centuries have put into this particular body at this particular time, is an ability to articulate and find words for things. People frequently, when they read Pollyanna, frequently when they read our stuff, they say, you're putting voice and words to stuff I've been thinking all along. Mm-hmm. And I want to be able to do that. Yeah. I want to be able to continue to do that. And that's where the fun is.
Yeah. The slightly cynical part of me listened to that list of things that you identified where this is a truism, and the two things that did not show up on that were politics and economics, which unfortunately are what drive so much of what our societal structure is right now, is driven by those.
But the questions at the heart of them are the same. The questions at the heart of them are the same. Is who gets to decide? Mm-hmm. Where are their resources? I mean, think about it. They're all the same questions. Where are their resources? Who gets to have them? Do we have enough? The collective enoughness is absolutely at the heart of both politics and do we have enough? And do we share or do we hoard? And we hoard from a place of scarcity. And
I think the other traditions naturally lead you to, I think, much of what the thinking is that is foundational to catalytic thinking. My experience and perspective is that those two realms not necessarily right now point us the other direction. Whether
they are rooted in economics. Economics pretends to be a science. But it's as manipulated as politics, and politics is decisions about power, and that always comes from scarcity. Yeah. That always comes from scarcity. So if we change the questions, who knows what might change? I don't know. I don't know, but it leads me to be asking you, as you know, traditionally the board was who had power, and we always know that that's in whatever way true or not. I would love your perceptions as a board member about this whole transition that we've been going through for the past several years, and how that has felt being inside of that, how the conversations have felt. Yeah, just.
So I think that first off, it has been very interesting and an experiment to ask those questions and to see the natural flow and manifestation. I mean, I think that it is a very good demonstration of, if you give space to the questions, the answers will present themselves. And even if they are, at first glance, may appear challenging, you'll see that really they are the opportunity to just pursue what all things are pointing towards. And I think, again, there are, enough instances in the conversations that the board has had over the past 3.5, 4 years that clearly point to that, where somebody has said, I don't know why we're asking the question. It's not a question anymore. It's declaring the answer, because the answer is already in it, so I think for me personally, there's an appreciation for being able to be in that space and see how that naturally evolves. I think the other side of that is the struggle that the board has felt around, again, the thing versus the thinking, which is, I think in many ways the board was very freed from having to be responsible for sustaining a viable entity of an organization. I mean, it was rarely ever talked about. Certainly board members talked about you and Dimitri and the workload and whether we were building or not. I mean, we weren't building anything, but were we supporting systems or practices that had, I think at one board meeting we said, burnout built into them. We were building systems of burnout. So I think that there was always that concern, but I don't think the board was ever really grounded in the thing of creating the future as an organization to worry about. And so in that sense, and I know you've talked about it before, is that part of the fiduciary responsibility was never really there. We were never monitoring the resources, other than you and Dimitri as people, which are obviously critical resources, but we weren't looking at financial resources. We weren't really asking the question of how are they being allocated? How are we getting them? What are the real program components that are there, which are the more traditional roles of that fiduciary responsibility.
And even when you were looking at those, because you were looking at them probably, every 6 months, something might come up about it where the financials would come up. And certainly you guys were looking at the 990 every year. The questions you were asking were not the traditional questions. Mm-hmm. So the questions you were asking were all about resources beyond money. Mm-hmm. And that is a really big difference, because, mm-hmm. and that's been from the beginning, and we baked it in.
I also think, out of transparency, there was a clear assumption that there wasn't a model that was sustainable. I mean, the organization, that there was never an assumption of that. So I think most of us were constantly looking to the future of we have to move this to something that is not going to demand this traditional structure, because we know it's well, not that it's not sustainable, but given the values that we were being held to and holding ourselves to, was we're not going to go down that road of just getting funding to sustain an organization that can pay Hildy and Dimitri or whomever the other staff are. So I think in that sense, the board was never, we never had that yoke around us of feeling that we always had a notion that this was going somewhere. And I think then the tension just was, are we moving that fast enough in terms of a structure? And then also, and again, I don't think I'm not speaking out of turn, because you can listen to any one of the board meetings and someone will say, some iteration of a version of what you're saying, which is, I don't feel like I'm a board person here. I feel like I'm coming to, a really interesting conversation, a theoretical conversation that we know has practical implications, but I could be having this conversation about any entity or any situation. It doesn't predispose me to feel that I'm a fiduciary of creating the future. And I mean that from the more traditional, not that, I mean, I think we all have always felt like we are contributors and valued in terms of our engagement, and that we are helping to shape it. But, I think that's part of what has sort of been the undercurrent, which is we're not really a board. We are not that. We don't fit the mold, and I think even some pushback of saying, I don't even think we're redefining what a board is. I think we are a group of people who have committed a level of interest and I guess I put in that commitment to say, I'm willing to help think through this. I don't know where it's going to go.
I'm really struck as you're talking that boards as they are traditionally understood, and all the stuff that you just said we don't do, what we don't do is waste time. And it's so interesting to me. Carl has said at the end of every board meeting since like God was a boy, these are really interesting conversations, but I'm not sure it's helping you, Hildy. And not understanding that, no, the traditional model doesn't help EDs at all, ever. And what having a place to explore the deepest thinking of what would it look like. Here's the issue. Issue number one came up today. We got to talk about this issue. Doesn't matter what it is. Okay, employee policies or whatever. The issue comes up. Having a place where committed people are talking through the values of what that would look like if it aligned and moved us forward. What more important thing could a group of leaders possibly be talking about? And it has always been so funny to me that we're so conditioned by the traditional board model that we don't realize this is what good would look like. Mm-hmm. That the board is there, that our community members are there, that there's only like 5-7 of us on the board. And frequently we've got 12 and 15 people in the room. And we're all talking through what would walking the talk of our values look like when it comes to issue number one. And do we get guidance out of that about what pragmatically will we do? Of course. It just shines a light for me on what good would look like if those were the discussions that leaders had. Picture those conversations about people being healthy in this country, because I'm not going to call it healthcare. Picture the exact conversations we have as a board around healthcare in the United States. Everybody would agree. Everybody would come to, what are our values? And so it is a powerful statement. I'm loving the other thing that I'm aware of as you're talking about. Yeah, you guys are as fiduciary as you're going to be with a budget that's $60,000. Dimitri and I have funded Creating the Future by not taking a salary for a long time because I was blessed with a small inheritance that my mom left that we could do that. But I can't tell you the number of people who have come to me over the years and said, I am disgusted that the board doesn't step in and require that you have a salary. Now, walk that one through for me. What were you guys going to do? Did you have a magic wand? Did you? No, what you guys were going to do was either go out and do fundraising, which is not a board's job, or you were going to say, Hildy, go out and get some grants. We order you to go out and get some grants, which would mean that all of the work Creating the Future has accomplished, a third of it might have gotten accomplished. A quarter of it might have gotten accomplished because we would have spent all of our time looking for $10,000 and $20,000 grants. Because in startup, that's what you get. You get go-away money. You get $10,000 and $20,000 grants that you don't get the $250,000, the $500,000 that you need to actually run something. So I feel so solidly wonderful about the work the board has done. And I just always smile at the fact that individually board members have expressed to me over time, I don't know, are we doing what we should be doing? And no, you're actually doing way better.
Well, I never had the presumption that we were doing what we should be doing. I knew right off the bat we weren't. So if that's at all
knowledge,
yeah, that yeah, in terms of that.
Yeah,
so.
It's in when the board finally made the decision back in 2016. It was one of my favorite board meetings we've ever had, and I love our board meetings. Where we asked, Angie said, well, if we're going to talk about do we do this or not, what's the worst that could happen if we do, and what's the worst that could happen if we don't? We used catalytic thinking. Showing the clip of your comment about, do we really even need to talk more about this? But when push came to shove and the decision was, okay, guys, are we going to go forward and restructure? Your comments during that time were pretty much, and I know I'm paraphrasing at this point, this is a done decision. This is we can't put that old genie back in the bottle. Talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about why.
Well, I think that's some of what I was speaking to, of how the process gets you to a decision that you don't have to actually make because it's already made and painted there. I think, again, as I was talking about that process of revisiting those larger outcome desires of the organization, the fact that what we were pointing towards and wanting to contribute to and be an added benefit to was, humanity and how people engage with one another day to day. And that doesn't happen through the lever of an organization. I mean, I think as we traditionally see, that's what I was saying earlier, which is programs don't make people behave more humanely day to day. It's a whole series of conditions that they experience that, as you begin to think that, I mean, that's the causality, which is for people to behave this way, they have to be experiencing a lot of different conditions, none of which a sole entity can create or any single lever can. And so, and I don't know that how specific we were, but in my thinking, that naturally, that pushes you towards movement thinking and movement building, which is, okay, if we are talking about community-wide behavioral change, culture shift, which is what this is, that requires movement. And if that's what it requires, you can no longer think of yourselves outside of that construct. And you have to then be thinking of yourself as a component of movement building. And I think so as we explored that and looked at some of those models and talked about that, I mean, for me, that's where it was clear, which was, if we have just said through the thinking that this can't be done on a one-to-one person basis, so there is no answer. If whatever the answer is doesn't fit that construct, if it doesn't create those conditions, it's not an answer. I mean, it just isn't. It's, you know, as we think about this idea of, you know, first there's, and I'm drawing this on something that was just recently shared to me actually by some other fellows around. I don't even know I mean, it's so new. I just looked at it this morning, but the framing is, you know, we develop understanding, we establish choices, and then we make decisions. And each one's a little different. And I think we did go through that evolution of, we created that understanding of what it would take to do this. And so, and in so doing, we came to that conclusion of, this is movement building. That's what this is. Even if we don't know exactly what it takes to do that, we know that's what it is. And so then the choices are, okay, now we have to come up with choices that fit movement building, because that's now our understanding. Anything that doesn't fit that model, it's not actually a viable choice. It shouldn't even come up into the hopper. I mean, we can have the idea, but we have to vet it. And so, you know, for me, that progression, then when it came to making a decision, well, you know, again, we weren't choosing between one model or another. We were choosing to pursue a direction and more exploration. So that's why it was an easy, and in my mind, a foregone conclusion. Like, to not do that would be to disregard every single road sign that was put in front of us, and to literally turn around and, I mean, I don't know if it was going on, you know, whatever the analogy is, it was definitely going off road. It wasn't following the path that we had spent so much time coming to understand. So.
Well, I am looking forward to our fellows and supporters coming together with us and doing a Q&A, because I'm sure we left stuff out or glossed over it or got lost in somebody's long rambling conversation about something. Someone will ask us a pointed question and we'll actually answer it.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for this. This was a fun way to spend an hour.
Yes, definitely. I appreciate hearing your thoughts, being able to share. I mean, are there any other questions that you have for me?
Well, yeah, I would love to know, you asked about me personally. I would love to know about you personally, where you see both fitting into this thing that we're creating and just fitting into life.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because I think I've taken a microcosm or a macrocosm, I don't know how it relates to it, but that evolution of from planning to people in my own practice, of realizing the constructs of planning as we encounter it on a day-to-day basis has been challenging for me. And what has really excited me is the people component of it, of helping people understand how they can affect and create change at whatever level. And so I think, you know, so for me, one, being grounded in that, and just that that foundational element of the catalytic thinking around causation, and just opening, you know, I love to see that moment when someone finally realizes, aha, it's about the people. And you hear them starting to talk about, you know, I want to see, you know, so I'm working with a board and they're saying, you know, I want to hear them asking this question. It's like, oh, okay, that's that's an observable behavioral thing that you want to see. Okay, now, you know, okay, let's talk about what someone would need to be able to answer or ask that question. Like, and so for me, actually, this whole idea of framing everything around inquiry is really exciting. You know, this happened very early on when, you know, when we were first looking at the bylaws, and I think I had said, let's call them the Y laws. I've recently been working with an organization doing some charters for some their committees, and I said, well, your charter should just be the series of questions that the committee is supposed to be trying to find answers to. And those questions can be, like, it was an orientation group, you know, that was working on orientations. I said, the question the committee should be charged with is, do people feel oriented? Yeah, that's it.
Ready.
That is, now, you know, that's the question you're trying to answer. And to answer that question, you need to know, what does oriented feel like and look like? What does it take to be oriented? And then you do all the stuff that makes that happen. But like, that's your charter. Do people feel oriented? Or we teased it out a little bit, do people feel welcome, connected, and are they able to engage with the resources? But so to me, that's really exciting. And so that's for me in the work that I'm pursuing. I think relative to creating the future, I certainly, I think I share with you that synthesizing, connecting, discovery passion. And so I like places of learning and places of inquiry and places where people are trying to put language to things. People are bringing ideas that exist into the forum to be reconciled, to magnify, all of those components. So I see that, and being able to engage in that element, having a recharge place, a place to go to where my tank is filled with either new ideas or energy, and I think it is the nature of how I work and who I am, which is I'm very much a dip my toe in, come to the spa, and then go and take that and see how it projects out into the rest of my world that's out there and proliferating in that way. And I sometimes struggle with, what does that mean with sort of the circling back to that entity that recharged me? And so there is a deep curiosity on my part too for where this is going, because like one thing in my future is the desire to never run an organization, because that's,
you and I cannot run it together.
Yeah. So it's the same kind of thing. So there's always a natural wall that I put up, which is, okay, this is getting close to running an organization. I don't want that. That's there. But I'm not sure I fully answered your question in that. But I think that it is exciting for me to envision something that is in that movement realm. It is where I'm seeing my work, to work in the social benefit realm, to experience the world as we see it now. I mean, I know I was a bit sardonic about the economics and politics, but I think they are systems right now that are forcing more scarcity mentality and as I work with organizations and see they have these models that are trying to get the scarcity model to expand by asking for their share of it, I look at it, I say, it's all things are pointing that this is not getting better before it gets worse. So I wouldn't, you can't hang you're not going to be around long enough if you keep with that strategy. And so movement building is now evolving with a lot of organizations. They're looking at saying, wow, the only way to get this is to bake a different pie. We can't eat this pie anymore.
It's one of the things that excites me about restructuring this thing is that, as you and I were talking before, there is no realm in which this current organizational structure is actually creating fabulous results. It may be creating narrow profits in terms of dollars for an organization, but in terms of fabulous results for bringing out the best in people and situations around the world, it ain't working. And the thought that we could be part of a movement just to rethink organizations, because there is definitely a movement afoot. The commons movement is huge, and seeing ourselves as a commons is just brings me such joy. But I think about people who are doing work on the ground, the day-to-day work of, let's say, a food bank. And imagine a food bank that's not seeing itself as a hierarchical organization, but seeing itself as part of a movement, seeing itself as an experiment, seeing as because that whole notion of we have to act like experts or nobody will fund us. Well, that's absurd. If you know the answer to hunger, then why haven't you shared it in the 50 years that there's been food banks? So perhaps we can stop saying we know what we're doing, and we can say we're an experiment. And we're trying this over here when it comes to food, and we're trying this when it comes to poverty, and we're trying this when it comes to literacy. Whoa! And just the freedom that brings, the permission to breathe. And so, yeah, I will be with you in not running anything you don't want to run.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.